Hi, good to see you. When a teacher witnessed what his best student was doing with the child, he decided to follow them home. The instructor started crying amid the lively classroom. A young nervousness permeated the air as students whispered that recess was almost here. Antonio, the historical instructor renowned for his dedication to his students' welfare, saw his best student in the middle of the well-organized pandemonium. The once enthusiastic and engaged child, Tomás, was now seated at the back of the classroom, his dark eyes vacant and apathetic. In sharp contrast to his typical exuberance, they appeared to be dead in contemplation. Antonio felt his heart sink as he saw his brightest student so disconnected. He has witnessed clever students becoming lost in that impoverished community before. When they displayed similar symptoms, Antonio tried his best to support his students in continuing their studies. Antonio wished he was mistaken, particularly since Tomás was such a bright youngster and he enjoyed. With every second of silence from Tomás, he worried more and more that studying would land him in problems outside of school. So, at the end of class, Antonio quietly pulled Tomás aside and said, "Tomás, you've been quiet lately. Everything is fine with you." Antonio spoke in a quiet but concerned tone, and for a split second, Tomás's eyes met Antonio's, and Antonio saw a spark of something that he was unable to describe pass through them. "Professor, I'm okay. I'm simply feeling a little worn out," Tomás answered, his voice so quiet as to be nearly inaudible above the cacophony of the other students making their way out. Antonio gestured that he was not persuaded, but his gut told him there was more out there, trying to make sense of the whole thing. He trailed behind Tomás. Keeping a cautious distance from the school, he surprised himself by deviating from the norm. Rather, Tomás went into an old, partially open building. Tears streamed down the teacher's cheeks. With his eyes, Tomás found himself in front of an antiquated chalkboard, recording everything Antonio had taught that day. A group of obviously impoverished kids behind him also recorded everything he wrote and paid unusual attention in class. The boy was imparting study skills to individuals who were sent away from school, or perhaps to kids who aren't allowed to learn because of their parents' illiteracy. The teacher's eyes continued to stream tears down his covered face as he felt pride well up inside his chest. He stayed for the entire lesson, shocked that the young student could recall every word uttered by him during the day, instructing concealed in a door's shadow and repeating them. Antonio watched the inquiries from Tomás's pupils. The scene made his heart constrict. He is striving to change it. So why did he seem so depressed in class? How can I assist him? He reflected, appreciating the boy's will to share his wisdom. After completing the session and bidding the kids farewell, Tomás made his way home. The student left the house with hesitant, almost reluctant steps, as though he was having trouble doing so. Discarded Antonio trailed him, keeping a safe distance as they got closer to Tomás's residence. The boy slowed his step. Antonio bided his time until the boy came inside. When he observed the child with his shoulders hunched over entering his modest home, he wondered himself, why is he so nervous? Sadly, the professor had to wait a few seconds until an unsettling noise shattered the afternoon silence. From inside Tomás's house came screams. The high-pitched sound of the angry discussion piercing the air scared the professor. Antonio didn't think twice. Instead, he simply considered the best course of action. He had to take care of the kid at home. The intensity of the shouts kept growing. The instructor was shocked as she heard the insults. The words were too forceful, severe, and derogatory. "This is not fair to Tomás." In his head, he whispered. The moment he stepped in Tomás Antonio's front door, the choice to step in solidified in his thoughts. His heart weighed a ton as he got closer to the house. Observing the shouts that reverberated through the silence, feeling the weight of his obligation, Street took a deep breath, mustered the confidence, and knocked on the door with resolve. "I have to step in and stop this," he thought to himself. Who is in attendance? Through the partially open door came the loud, irritated voice of a guy who was undoubtedly Tomás's father. "It's me, Antonio, the teacher. We must discuss the student's circumstances." Antonio firmly replied, facing the suspicious gaze of Conrado. As the door opened completely, "You must be Mr. Conrado, correct? My student's father asked the teacher. Remembering the name of the student's father that was on his file, the man frowned. His face was clearly dissatisfied with the visit. Yes, it's me. But you have nothing to interfere in our life, Professor. What happens in my house is my business. Trick, his voice rising with anger. Antonio, remaining calm, replied. I care about Tomás' well-being, and it is difficult to ignore when I see clear signs that something is wrong. He is an intelligent child, and he should not be subjected to this. His concern was evident, and he hoped his words would reach somewhere in Conrado's heart. Conrado's response was a low growl. Take care of your own life, Professor, or you are going to feel guilty about it. Antonio shuddered at the barely disguised threat, but his resolve did not falter. He knew that the conversation would not end in peace and that he had to keep Tomás safe. No, Antonio commanded. Tomás is injured by me. Threats don't terrify me, he remarked, shaking his head. The teacher hurried to assist the child by going straight to the closest police station. I hope we can take action once he fully revealed everything, including Tomás' actions at school and the screaming I had heard. He looked seriously at the cop who was recording everything and said, before it's too late. When Antonio got home that day, he thought back on all that had transpired. I made the proper choice in not doing so. I'm hoping that Tomás is all right and that the authorities have taken appropriate action. He was concerned that the following day, Conrado might take revenge. Anxiety knotted in his stomach while he was getting ready for school. Antonio was met with troubling news when he got to school. Tomás hadn't shown up to class. How did he act? Aware of what might happen, Conrado mumbled to himself. Antonio started looking for Tomás right away, determined to locate him. He went to all of Tomás's favorite spots, the school park, where he'd often seen the youngster playing with pals, the little library where the boy enjoyed reading, and even the student cafeteria where Tomás used to purchase candies to eat at school. The response in every location was, nobody had seen Tomás. Where to start now? The teacher chose to visit the abandoned building where he had witnessed Tomás teaching lessons in order to determine whether or not he was assisting the school students, a decision that worried Antonio more and more. Community, but it was deserted. Worried, he went to the boy's house, thinking the father had locked him inside. But when he knocked on the door, no one answered, and the house was empty. The teacher didn't give up and went back to the school, searching as he went. He was driven by a combination of anxiety and resolve across the school's hallways, and when he arrived at the teacher's room, he noticed his colleagues' faces reflecting his own concern. They relayed the disturbing news to him that day, Tomás missed class, which he never does without warning that something was seriously wrong. With hope dwindling and dread rising in his chest, Antonio muttered to himself. He made the decision to speak with Tomás' acquaintances and ask if anyone knew of any resources that could assist them. Even though they were equally concerned, Tomás' friends didn't know where he was. One of them noted that Tomás had been busy lately, but he didn't know why. He was just concerned that something unsettling was occurring. The buddy opened up, feeling the weight of doubt as she cast a sorrowful glance at the ground devoid of any hints. Antonio went back to his living room to see if there was anything helpful that Tomás had left behind. Examining Tomás's notes, he searched for any highlighting of a location or a plan that the young man he may have thought about a haven. Antonio thought, hurriedly turning the pages. Perhaps he had written anything in a paper or in an exercise. Antonio was abruptly cut off by Severino, the head of the institution, who, his face was stern as he walked into the room. I have to tell you something, Antonio. One of your students' fathers. While you were teaching this morning, Tomás was present. He is taking Tomás out of the classroom. You are meddling too much in his private life, he said. The director articulated his discomfort with the situation, saying, we should not get too involved in the lives of our students. Please stop getting involved, or I will have to take drastic action against you. Antonio, however, saw past Severino's explanation. He was surprised to hear the director threaten to terminate him if he helped the child any longer. Antonio had a surge of annoyance. Conrado can't just shut Tomás off from the outside world, so I'll take whatever action is required to keep the kid safe. I should have the director's backing to assist Tomás, but I've already seen him act as though he can't tell when a student is having difficulties in class. I must handle this on my own. And even with the internal tremor, Antonio thought, his voice solid, if he could do it without losing his job. As soon as after the principal departed, the teacher became even more resolved to find a solution and made the decision to get legal counsel in order to meet Tomás' father and defend the child. I'm going to get my lawyer, Hugo, to come in. Tomás needs to be brought back, and we need to make sure he is secure. After seeking his lawyer for assistance in resolving the matter, he came to the conclusion that the youngster was undoubtedly living in an abusive environment as he picked up the phone to make the most crucial call of his life. Antonio was aware of every heartbeat while Tomás's urgent situation needed to be communicated to a network of colleagues and acquaintances in order to prepare for a larger search for him. In an impromptu meeting, he explained that Tomás needed to be found before it was too late, and his colleagues' determined expressions demonstrated this sense of urgency. After dividing the city into search zones, they started asking people, door to door, if they had seen Tomás or knew of any place where he might be. Please give it some thought. Any tiny, a particular detail can be helpful to us, Antonio worriedly questioned. Disappointment was starting to set in at the end of the day after Antonio and his accomplices had visited numerous streets and spoken with scores of people, but Antonio refused to give up. Give up. Tomorrow won't be any different. We can't give up. Even though he was tired, he encouraged himself now. Antonio got home and his phone rang. A call came in from an unidentified number. Hi, who is this? Antonio said, attempting to conceal his nervousness. In his voice greetings, Professor Antonio, a timid voice on the other end of the telephone, said, I heard that you are looking for Tomás. I think I know where he may be. Please tell me where you think he is. Antonio answered quickly, his heart pounding at the thought of possibly finding Tomás at last. He's at the ancient cabin in the city park at the end of the path. I've watched him walk in there multiple times, and each time he disclosed the voice, a bit more assured now that he had this new knowledge. After calling his closest associates, Antonio departed for the. Even though it was getting dark, they continued to walk along the path, led only by the faint glow from their flashlights and a newfound sense of hope. As they got closer to the cabin that Antonio, the informant, had described, they felt both relieved and afraid because it was in ruins and concealed among tall trees. A location I would never have thought Tomás would choose to hide. Antonio yelled out, Tomás, you are there, his voice resonating in the silence. The sound of the wind in the leaves was all that was heard in return. With his heart in it, Antonio stepped toward the door. Thumping with fear and excitement for what he could discover within, Antonio carefully pushed the creaking cabin's door. He could almost feel the absolute darkness within, barely broken by the faint glow from the flashlight that shook in his fingers. Antonio heard Tomás call for him again, and this time it was a nervous murmur coming from the rear of the cabin, accompanied by a faint groan. He moved the beam forward warily, exposing the interior's deserted interior bit by bit. At last, the light beam settled on a diminutive figure. Tomás, clearly hurt, was curled up in a corner with one arm bandaged with what appeared to be a makeshift bandage. Professor Antonio, Tomás muttered. The light cast on his face revealed obvious traces of pain. In the thick of the agony, the youngster said, I knew he would find me. Antonio dropped to one side of the youngster, his chest heaving with fear and rage, asking, Who did this to you? Tomás inquired. Looking away, Tomás admitted that he knew the answer was my dad. He also found that he was assisting the other kids and, You visited my home and expressed dissatisfaction, he uttered in a weak tone. Antonio's heart constricted. We're going to help you leave this place. He helped Tomás stand up and said, I'm going to take care of those wounds and make sure you don't have to go back to that situation.
Tomás gav hjem assistanse.
Antonio left the cabin with his shoulder raised, prepared to face Conrado as soon as he could. He brought the youngster to the ER, where medical attention was given to his wounds. But it didn't take long for the hospital to notify the boy's father. Conrado was enraged. When he saw his son with Antonio in the hospital, his face twisted with rage. He didn't appear concerned about Tomás's condition. Instead, his fury was uncontrollably intense. Why are you intruding into my problems, Professor? What are you doing here, trying to take my son? As he got closer, Conrado yelled, Life, drawing the attention of some passers-by by the hospital. Antonio said angrily, I'm protecting Tomás, something that you should be doing as a father. And he stood in front of Tomás, who was defending him while resting on the hospital bed. He feels afraid and hurt behind him. People walking by the corridor started to pause at the door, forming a small circle to observe what was occurring, whispering and exchanging shocked stares. Conrado, this is not how a father should treat his son. Conrado turned to face the accusing glances as he noticed them. I assure you that you will pay a heavy price for this, Antonio. Conrado spoke in a low tone, threatening with words that carried a dark promise. Antonio, he maintained a steady, unyielding stare. I'll do whatever it takes to safeguard Tomás, and now that witnesses have seen your actions, I think justice will be served. The child will be brought to my residence, where I will tend to him. I'll make sure you don't harm him once more, he stated, prepared to take any action necessary to protect the youngster as the situation worsens and the number of people in the area grows. Conrado took a step back, giving Antonio and Tomás one last scathing glance, then turned and walked out into the hospital hallway. Antonio let out a sigh, aware of the impending consequences and simultaneously feeling relieved. He turned to face Tomás, whose smile of gratitude said louder than words could. The physicians therefore decided to release Tomás. With their minds made up, they turned to face the city's light, to confront whatever happened next. After deciding to bring Tomás home from the hospital, Antonio experienced a mixture of relief and concern. Though difficult, it appeared to be the only secure course of action available to them before returning home. We require travel somewhere. Antonio told the youngster that Tomás needed assistance from the school administration as well as legal counsel on the way back to his residence. After getting to school, Antonio and Tomás made their way through the hallways, each stride full of resolve, until they reached Severino, the director's office, where Antonio hoped to receive some assistance. Severino, I know you requested me to stay out of this matter, but I have to talk to you about an important issue where Tomás has been the victim of severe abuse at the hands of his own father. I brought the boy to protect him because I can't let him suffer at the hands of his father, and I need your help. While Tomás sat silently next to Antonio, he started to give a quick account of all that had happened. The director listened intently, but expressed anxiety. Severino answered, folding his arms over his shoulder, I understand your concern, Antonio, and I commend your commitment, but the school cannot be directly involved in family members of this nature. We cannot offer the type of support you are asking for. Antonio experienced a mixture of shock and frustration. Severino, we're talking about a kid who has obviously been harmed. How can we ignore this? This isn't just a disagreement. The student's safety is at stake. He insisted, trying not to show his annoyance in his voice. I get it, but there's only so much we can do. Severino said, my recommendation is that you seek outside legal assistance, signaling the conclusion of the discussion. Antonio was not happy when he left the office, but, having lost and resolved to handle things on his own, Antonio gave Tomás an explanation of the circumstances and made sure he understood the legal procedure while driving to his lawyer's office. Tomás, we'll do everything within our power to keep you secure. You trust me, right? In an attempt to find solace in the boy's gaze, Antonio inquired. Tomás gave a nod, his face still displaying terror from what had happened. However, there was a glimmer of optimism. You have my trust, Professor. I appreciate you looking after me, he muttered. Antonio arrived at Hugo's office with a complete dossier filled with the evidence he had gathered, including pictures of Tomás' injuries and in-depth explanations of the episodes. His thankfulness was palpable in his weak voice. Hugo studied the documents closely, his countenance usually solemn. This Antonio, we will draft a petition for emergency custody and a restraining order against the father because this is a severe matter. You're acting appropriately. Hugo began to type rapidly. I hope you get custody of the child. Computer Hugo was working on the legal paperwork while Hugo had prepared some documents. So Antonio sat next to Tomás and held his hand as a show of solidarity. They knew that the battle would be drawn out and full of legal obstacles, but Antonio was willing to go to any lengths to ensure Tomás's safety. He glanced at Tomás and Antonio. We will bring this before the court as soon as we can. I'll be here for you during the entire procedure. Regarding taking the youngster home, don't worry. The jury will be persuaded that you made the proper decision based on the evidence of the beatings. Better now that the police hadn't helped the boy, he said, passing a copy of the paperwork to Antonio as he walked out of the twilight office. Antonio experienced a dual sense of resolve and worry. He was aware that the coming weeks would be critical and possibly challenging, but he also understood that he was not alone in Tomás Agelado's situation and that a capable attorney like Hugo had the potential to improve the boy's future. Together, they were prepared to face whatever came with the truth and justice at their side at home because Antonio cared. Of the boy receiving all the attention, including treating to his wounds, who always appeared happy to receive care as though no one had ever done so for him. Given everything the child said, including the fact that his mother died giving birth and that his father had never supported him, as well as the fact that he was too small to care for himself, Antonio felt obligated to seek custody of the child in order to aid the little being that had endured so much at such a young age. This professor, he knew, that even though it would not be simple, he would find a way to care for Tomás so that the youngster would never have to feel abandoned. The hallway was filled with the anxious echoes of low-voiced talks, weeks after the legal process for Tomás's custody began. Tomás, seated next to him, clutched Antonio's hand firmly, his wide eyes showing a mixture of fear and optimism. "Everything is ready, Antonio," Hugo remarked as he walked over holding a packet containing. "Proves the validity of the argument furthermore. There is sufficient data to demonstrate that the father's environment is unsuitable for in a professional manner." Tomás addressed the attorney. Antonio nodded, expressing determination, saying, "I'm ready no matter what happens. We need to make sure that Tomás is in a place." "Of course," he said. As the hearing got underway, Conrado's attorney, a man with an assertive gait and rapid-fire speech, started to question the action, casting a critical gaze on the boy sitting next to him who was attempting a bold smile. "Since my client is Antonio's biological father, he is entitled to continue having custody of the boy." The opposing attorney shot Antonio a cold look, claiming that Mr. Antonio's claims are inflated and not grounded in a full grasp of the family circumstances. Calm and composed, Hugo produced pictures of Tomás's wounds, doctor's notes, and statements from nearby residents who had witnessed the regular, violent altercations. "It is not safe for Tomás. This goes beyond a disagreement," he answered sharply. "Family is a matter of child protection," which echoed in the ensuing stillness. The man in the middle, the judge, seemed serious as he listened and took notes after each presentation. With a shaky voice, he called Tomás to speak, but Clara Tomás related her story. "All I want is to be in a secure environment." Tomás recalled, "Professor Antonio looked after me and helped me when I needed it most." Looking appreciatively at Antonio following a protracted argument and multiple exchanges of legal charges, the tension in the air was almost palpable as the judge eventually withdrew to decide. After what seemed like an age, the judge reappeared prepared to make his announcement. "After taking into account the evidence that had been submitted as well as the minor's testimony, I have determined that Tomás, before a decision is reached, he will be detained in state custody in a shelter on a temporary basis. This will create a secure and impartial atmosphere," the judge said. "While we further assess this situation." Antonio was devastated by the decision because he had hoped to be able to bring Tomás home, but he could not let the youngster suffer any longer by placing him in state custody. Even though the young child had already endured too much suffering, he understood that this was a necessary step to eventually ensure complete safety of the child. "We will carry on battling Tomás, so you will have to go with them. However, know that I will do everything within my power to support and care for you. I won't give up," Antonio whispered to the youngster, who had tears in her eyes. Conrado departed the courtroom holding. Antonio watched him go with a solemn gaze that gently promised this would not be the end, reinforcing his resolve to defend Tomás no matter what obstacles remained. The legal struggle was only getting started, and Antonio was more determined than ever to stand up for Tomás. Antonio was depressed right up to the very end. Some weeks after the judge's ruling, the sorrow of having to part from Tomás and go into the state home after enduring so much anguish was a constant source of pain for him. On the day of visits, Tomás was dejected when he finally arrived at the state shelter where he was temporarily housed. He thought about the criticism that was starting to surface from different sources, with some co-workers and community members questioning whether his actions had been the most appropriate. He also wondered about the ethics of a teacher taking on such an active role in a student's personal life. When Antonio arrived to the shelter, a social worker met him and led him to the room where the child named Tomás was staying. He appeared more composed, but his eyes were clearly sorrowful. When he saw him come, Professor Antonio gave Tomás a weak grin while sitting next to him and tenderly holding his hand. "How are you, Tomás? I'm trying everything I can to get back together with you," he started. Antonio attempting to provide some comfort with a terrified voice. Tomás looked down and played with the hem of his shirt. "I know, Professor. I'm just afraid of not being able to go back to school or see you again," he admitted. Ambiguity, the boy with tears in his eyes added. "I'm afraid of losing everything. I'm also worried about the kids I taught." "Don't think that way, Tomás. I assure you that I won't give up until you're safe and we can get back to our regular lives. You're strong, and when we work together, we can overcome anything. After everything is settled, we'll take action to support the kids you taught," Antonio said, hoping to give them a sense of hope that they are not alone. Antonio stayed there for a while, playing with the child, until the social worker entered the room to announce that the visit was about to finish, interrupting the fun. Although Antonio nodded in comprehension, the thought of even momentarily abandoning Tomás there made his heart ache. Before departing, Antonio leaned nearer. "Go ahead and listen to Tomás while maintaining a somber and protective tone. I want you to know that you are not alone and that what is occurring is not your fault. I promise to be here for you no matter what." Tomás gave a short hug while nodding and shedding tears. Antonio, as he left the shelter, he mumbled, "Thank you, Professor. Please don't forget me here." His voice broke with grief. More than ever, Antonio felt the weight of obligation bearing down on him. He was aware that the impending court dispute would be difficult, but because of the faith and confidence that Tomás placed in it, he was even more determined to fight back when he got home. He went over in his head every step that needed to be taken in the upcoming days, ready to battle not just as a teacher but also as someone who had vowed to protect Tomás and everyone. Costa Antonio walked out of the state shelter with a range of feelings in his heart. The talk he had just had with the boy had strengthened his resolve to defend Tomás more than ever. They were getting ready to delve further into the investigation back in Hugo's office. "Regarding Tomás Conrado's father, Hugo, we require additional details regarding Conrado's past," Antonio replied, taking a seat in front of the table. "I'm sure we're not dealing with an isolated case of negligence." Filled with numerous documents pertaining to the case, Hugo nodded and began navigating the computer to find historical information. "I'm going to go over every police and assistance report from the past. I think there might have been something missed or unreported before the tumultuous hours that followed." Hugo and Antonio went over a ton of records in an attempt to find any trends or prior abuse evidence that might have been overlooked or misunderstood. Every new finding increased the importance of defending Tomás. More definite, Antonio, look. This is Hugo pointing to the screen. Years ago, a neighbor reported hearing regular cries coming from Conrado's house. The lawyer, energized by the finding, seemed to belittle it at the time, considering it to be a minor family dispute. After Antonio concluded that more testimony were required, they spent the following few days going around Conrado's area and speaking with locals who were familiar with the dynamics of the family. Many were reluctant to talk, but Antonio's sincerity and compassion persuaded them to express what they had noticed. An elderly woman who lived next door and observed everything from her window said that she often saw Tomás playing by himself and, with a seemingly nonchalant air, remarked that she had always felt that Tomás needed more attention. The mother felt bad for the young child because each witness strengthened Antonio and Hugo's case and added layers of intricacy. They knew they would have challenges, though. Opposition: a key witness, a former friend of Tomás' mother who had first-hand knowledge of Conrado's violent behavior against his wife before to having Tomás, as well as how she had previously taken care of the boy, surfaced as the next hearing date drew near. But the dad was reluctant to testify after his birth. "I'm scared of what Conrado will do if he finds out that I spoke, even if I want to help Antonio." The acquaintance admitted to being hazardous at a heated discussion at a nearby cafe. Antonio put his hand on the man's shoulder and looked deeply into his eyes. "Your help can change Tomás's life for the better. I promise you that we will do everything possible to protect you, he said. His voice as clear and sincere as the man's dedication. He nodded slowly. It appeared that speaking was becoming less and less of a moral burden. It's okay. Testifying for Antonio is the right thing to do. He ultimately agreed to this, giving the case fresh momentum. With this assurance, Antonio and Hugo departed the cafe. As the custody case developed, they felt that they were getting closer to ensuring Tomás' safety and future. It was a difficult battle, but with every step they took, they got stronger and better equipped to handle whatever came their way. As Tomás gained popularity, the media started to concentrate on Antonio. Cameras and reporters swarmed the court, ready to document any new developments in the narrative, which by now was gripping the public because of how heinous the crimes were. Maltreatment of the child. Physically, Antonio was aware of the gravity of the situation, concerned about how it might affect the case, and aware that everyone was watching him. As Antonio walked inside the courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation because the hearing was about to come to a close. Starred as Hugo walked over, his expression filled with concern. Hugo disclosed, "We have a problem, and Conrado is thinking about making a deal." Glancing back to make sure there was nobody else there, Antonio was listening, scowling in shock. "What kind of agreement?" he inquired. The boy's father did not appear to be the kind to change his mind, so he suggests that you give up complete custody in exchange for making sure that Tomás can visit him frequently and pursue his education without hindrance. Hugo handed him a letter outlining the suggested parameters and explained that, nevertheless, he wants all the accusations made against him to be dropped. Antonio took a minute to consider the conflict on his face. The deal might ensure that Tomás would be raised by a member of his own family, his own father, but it also left Conrado free to avoid taking full responsibility for his crimes and did not ensure the child's protection. This sounds more like a way for him to evade justice. Antonio firmly stated during a break, "We need to talk to Tomás about this because, despite the suffering, he is his father, and I want him to know everything. I cannot in good conscience accept this without considering what is best for Tomás." Hugo and Antonio managed to get a time to speak with Tomás, carefully outlining the circumstances. Tomás, who was already acting much older than his years because of the situation, paid close attention to his thoughtful expression. "You should be my guardian, please. Professor, even if it means seeing that man again. I do not want to live with him. Occasionally, I feel secure in your presence," Tomás stated. Antonio felt revitalized by Tomás's choice, which Clara reinforced. "We're going to reject the deal and fight to the very end. Last to guarantee your happy and safe future." Hugo nodded, and Antonio said, "I know the next few weeks will be crucial, with the media watching every move and the pressure increasing, so I'm ready to defend Tomás at any cost." Antonio was also preparing the paperwork to inform the court that they would reject the offer while they prepared for the next phase of the trial. There was an obvious determination on both sides, a bond established not just by legal requirements but also by a sincere and intense dedication to Tomás's welfare. Antonio was seated in front of the court waiting room's huge window, with the documents in front of him glowing golden in the last light of the evening sun. "I really need to stay with you, Professor. I don't want to go back to my father," Tomás said, his feet swaying in response to Conrado's proposed agreement, which was a clear indication of his anxiety. Each document served as a reminder of the decisions that weighed on his shoulders. Stern voice. Antonio turned to face the child, his countenance softening even though his eyes conveyed his fear of maybe returning to the life he so desperately wanted to leave behind. "Someone who has your own blood," he whispered, sharing with the child all he felt. Squeezing Antonio's hand, "Tomás, that doesn't matter. What matters to me is being in a place where I feel safe and loved, and with you, I've learned more from you than just from books." Tomás, his tenacity. Claire, moved by the story, begged her not to let them take her back. Tomás's valor. Antonio experienced a surge of resolve. "I swear to do my absolute best. We'll battle together to ensure you have the future you deserve," Antonio said as a determined expression filled his face, but the jury appeared undecided this time. In order to refute the notion that someone other than family could provide the same level of care for the child as someone of their own blood, Tomás' father had made arguments stating that the youngster had to live with someone who had the same blood. A second day was added to the hearing. But after those arguments, Antonio was more afraid because it seemed like everyone would leave Tomás with Conrado. When Antonio went back to Hugo's office to discuss strategy, he was certain that the youngster should not live with someone from his own family who had mistreated him, even if that meant suffering the repercussions. Hugo was working on the closing arguments for the upcoming hearing. Antonio, we're doing the right thing. You are the person Tomás needs to stand up for him. Therefore, don't let their arguments demoralize you. Hugo responded, grinning encouragingly, today. But during a heated phone call, Hugo told Conrado that Antonio had refused the deal, and the boy's father reacted with fury. He gave Antonio a warning that he would stop at nothing to maintain control of Tomás. You'll be sorry you did, Conrado yelled, his voice full of rage. Having gotten you into this, Antonio, I told you that I don't friend you if he continues to support you in court. After hanging up, Antonio inhaled deeply to maintain composure. That is unimportant. He turned to Hugo, who was noting down the threats on a notepad and was already considering how this would affect the case, and stated, whatever he says, we are going to protect Tomás. Hugo and Antonio put forth a lot of effort in the days that followed to gather more evidence and get ready for the last courtroom confrontation. As the date of the pivotal hearing drew nearer, Antonio made every effort to see Tomás, deepening their friendship and reiterating their resolve to fight to the bitter end. Antonio was ready for more than just legal struggle, but also to protect their capacity to provide Tomás with a loving and safe home. The community mobilized, with many openly endorsing Antonio after being inspired by his commitment, and the courtroom was charged with tension for Tomás's welfare. Hugo moved behind him as everyone got ready for the final hearing in the custody case of Tomás Antonio. His somber and focused demeanor conveyed the gravity of the situation. Antonio, today is the day that all of our hard work has paid off. Hugo took one last look at the papers before giving them to the judge, whispering, you will be put to the test. Antonio nodded and inhaled deeply to keep his composure. There was a respectful silence in the room when the judge arrived. Antonio got to his feet, prepared to make one last point. This is why we're here today, Your Honor. Not just to talk about child custody, but also to make decisions about the child's future and well-being. With Clara's voice resonating across the room, Antonio started up by saying, Tomás has been subjected to situations that no child should. Antonio added, I introduce myself as his teacher and as someone who genuinely cares about him. I am not here out of obligation, but rather out of a commitment to Tomás' safety and happiness. He has lived through abuse and fear. Watchful eyes followed Antonio as he spoke. Conrado clearly felt the impact. Antonio was attempting to remain composed in light of Antonio's remarks, and his attorney was getting ready to make a counterargument that would emphasize biological links and charge Antonio with going beyond the call of duty. Conrado emphasizes biological relationships, but are they sufficient to maintain Tomás in this situation where he endures such great suffering? I pose this question to the court. Is a caring and secure environment or blood ties more important? Hugo asked in response to Antonio Tomás's seat toward the rear of the room. When his name was called to testify, the room watched everything with nervous eyes as he hesitantly made his way to the stand. All I want is to remain where I feel secure. I learned what it meant to have someone from Professor Antonio. Someone genuinely feels anything for me, Tomás said in a voice that was almost a whisper. A father is the one who takes care of me like he has done. And then he turned to face Antonio. You are my father, he said, tears streaming down his face. Antonio felt his own heart melt, and he wished he could go to the boy and reassure him that everything would be okay. But he didn't want to give him false hope, so he said, I also consider you a son, Tomás said later. Of the evidence provided by Judge Tomás requested a short break before rendering a ruling. There were a lot of talks about the potential outcome in the court hallway. Antonio experienced a mixture of anxiety and hope as he was surrounded by the support of co-workers and some parents of pupils until everyone was called back. The judge entered the chamber and began to read his final ruling while maintaining a serious expression. After taking into account all of the testimony and evidence that was provided, he stated, stopping for what felt like a long time. Eternal. The court was enveloped in a thick hush. Tomás sat by Antonio and held his hand while they all waited for the judge's ruling. Antonio's eyes were riveted on the judge, whose grave demeanor made it difficult to predict the decision he would make. We are here to announce a crucial. This case presented us with unique challenges and sparked deep discussions about what truly constitutes the child's best interest, the judge said, his voice echoing around the chamber. Antonio sensed a knot tighten. Beside him, in his stomach after carefully reviewing all of the testimony and evidence, the judge continued, pausing briefly to gaze straight at Tomás, who appeared to be holding his breath. Tomás's eyes were locked on the judge, waiting for words that would determine his future. He winced a little at the judge's stare. In order to protect Tomás's safety and well-being, it was agreed to give Mr. Antonio complete custody of the youngster. Antonio gave a relieved breath. His feelings, with a mixture of appreciation and shock by his side, Tomás let go of the breath he appeared to have been holding for ages, and a smile started to appear on his face. But the judge interrupted, bringing the tension back for a moment. This decision comes with a clear understanding of the challenges ahead. Sir Antonio will face trials that will require commitment and continuous adaptation in order to assume responsibility for Tomás' well-being. We hope he will keep up his provision of an atmosphere that not only for Tomás's protection, but also to aid in his growth and education. Antonio nodded empathically and resolutely, saying, "I'm ready to do whatever it takes." His forceful voice replied, demonstrating his unshakable commitment to supporting Tomás both now and in the future. Tomás Antonio finally let the happy and relieved tears fall down his cheeks after hearing the judge's remarks. He said, "Thank you, Professor," and squeezed Antonio's hand once more as the audience started to thin out. Many people, touched by Antonio's commitment and devotion throughout the procedure, came to congratulate him. The press was waiting outside the court, but Antonio's attention was solely on Tom, whispering to him that nothing more would ever separate them. Together, Tomás and I will create a new life. The road ahead would be full of obstacles, but also chances for Antonio to fulfill his vow to Tomás and to himself, reinforcing his duties as a guardian and an educator. Grow and educate one another with one another's support. Antonio and Tomás felt more than merely victorious as they walked outside the courthouse in the growing dusk, ready to face whatever was ahead with the knowledge that justice and love would ultimately triumph. The new life that Antonio and Tomás shared began with a common daily routine of making breakfast and talking about plans for the day. Tomás, as the morning light streamed through the curtains of the home they now shared. "How would you feel if after?" Antonio offered, setting pancakes on the table. "Let's go see that space at school. That could be a great place to start our project." At this point, Tomás was clearly happy and more adjusted to his new life. With enthusiasm, he nodded. "Yes, I would like to help other kids the way you helped me." He smiled and used the title, "Professor, I think we can make a difference." Antonio was so much more than that today, though. Antonio considered the financial and practical difficulties they might have throughout their meal. "We will need volunteers and donations, but first we need a strong plan to present to the neighborhood and possible sponsors." The teacher always clarified this, even when they visited the project's potential location after school. An old warehouse in the neighborhood that could be converted into a community center where kids like the ones Tomás taught could come and learn for free. Tomás surveyed his surroundings, his eyes gleaming with ideas for a potential learning space. He remarked, planning aloud, "Reading here and maybe tables for art classes there," which made Antonio smile proudly. "The kids they taught will believe it." He added that when they got home and saw all of this, Antonio sat down while Tomás finished his schoolwork. To draft grant applications, although the assignment was difficult, the desire to make a positive impact on the community inspired him. "I need to help other children," the instructor stated as the phone rang in the middle of his writing. Hugo, his lawyer, answered with news regarding Antonio Conrado. "Hugo told me that Conrado is already facing justice after the jury chose to apply a legal penalty for abuse and neglect. Hugo told me that he had just gotten a call from the prosecutor regarding the case of Tomás, and I could feel the relief and closure this news provided." Tomás listened as Antonio filled him in on the circumstances. "That essentially means he won't be able to harm me in the future." With hesitation still lingering like a shadow in his impressionable eyes, Tomás questioned, "Exactly, Tomás, and we're here together safe and moving forward. You'll never have to again." Antonio reassured him, "I will never allow anyone to hurt you." and gave him a reassuring hug. However, if your father had changed after serving his time, we could discuss legal means of staying in touch. Being cautious is crucial, provided that it is safe and something you desire, and that you are aware of my constant availability. As Tomás slept that night, the professor said, Antonio remained up late, staring out the window at the moon. The upcoming weeks would be critical for solidifying his idea with Tomás as well as for make sure the threat posed by the past shadow did not. Antonio felt an iron will to defend the new life they were creating, one that was built on love, security, and education. Believed that Conrado would eventually change and they could forgive one another, but what mattered was that the youngster was safe now and would stay safe. He now carried on the initiative that Tomás had started in his neighborhood, growing it and taking steps to ensure that no youngster was left without an education. This is how I'm going to aid those kids. Years later, the change in Tomás and Antonio's lives prompted an even greater transformation. Tomás had fought a long battle, and although there were still obstacles to overcome, Antonio knew that every little effort was worthwhile to ensure that no other child suffered as Tomás suffered. Motivated by their journey, lawmakers enacted a new law that empowers educators like Antonio to take a more proactive approach to shielding kids from harm. This legislative action acknowledged the value of early educator involvement in cases of child abuse and gave educators the power and resources to work with social workers and law enforcement to take appropriate action. The project that Antonio and Tomás started had taken off and growing into an educational movement that was able to welcome hundreds of children and provide them with a safe haven in addition to instruction. Now a teenager, Tomás exuded power as he moved through the center's hallways. Courteous, willing to lend a hand when needed, and especially interested in pursuing Antonio's career path, Dad told Antonio one bright afternoon as they were reading books in the library, "I want to make a difference. One day, I want to be a teacher like you." The teenager said, "I want to give children what you gave me a chance." Antonio said to Tomás, "You are already making a difference," while also looking excited and proud. With the project's success, Tomás replied, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder and saying, "I have no doubt that you will be an excellent teacher." Now, Antonio and Tomás are living examples of kindness and change people's lives. Yet despite its difficulties, Tomás' voyage proved to be a strong force for good. With every child who completed the project, a new chapter of hope was begun, one that was based on the firm principles of love, education, and the unwavering commitment to protect every young person. Not only did they transform their own lives, but they also had a long-lasting impact on the community and society that went through its doors. We encourage you to like this video and subscribe to our channel if you enjoyed this tale. Your support helps us to keep delivering you interesting content practically every day. We are so happy to have you here with us. You can click on the links that are currently appearing on the screen to access a special that is just for you. It is guaranteed to be entertaining and full of valuable stories. Don't miss the next unexpected story that is about to appear on your screen. I'll see you there.